Good evening and welcome. Sir Isaac Newton once said that tact is the knack of making a point without making an enemy. The Pacific region over the past few years has realized the potential that lies in good and strong diplomacy. Tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Fiji's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Ambassador Nazhat Shameem Khan. Ma'am, welcome to For the Record, and I must say it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So, For the Record is a show that caters to ordinary Fijians who may not be fully aware of what actually happens at the United Nations and all of those high-level meetings. So, for the benefit of our everyday viewers, let's begin with the Human Rights Council. What does this council do, and what is its relationship with the United Nations?
So one of the most important responsibilities of the Fijian mission in Geneva is the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council is a subsidiary body of the United Nations. Its predecessor was the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, but it is generally agreed that the Human Rights Council is a more effective body. It is responsible for promoting human rights globally and helping states to improve their own human rights record on the ground in their own countries domestically. So it is really a UN body based in Geneva.
And how many members at a time does the Human Rights Council consist of?
47 member states.
Members. Okay.
Let's look at something that hits home for us in Fiji. There's a lot of talk going on about how the state of human rights in the country isn't what it should be. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important to know that the promotion and the implementation of human rights is always work in progress. There is no one country in the world which has a perfect human rights record, and no one can claim that. So to me, human rights and the implementation of human rights is a journey. We are lucky because we have a progressive constitution with a strong Bill of Rights, which is based on ICCPR and ISESCA rights. So it is a really good merger of both civil and political rights, such as freedom of thought, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, and economic, social and cultural rights, which is the right to education, the rights of persons with disabilities and so on. So this merger in our constitution really gives us a head start for implementation, but of course it's not as easy as that. What these rights mean, this journey and this interpretation has been done by UN bodies, the treaty bodies of the United Nations, as well as by human rights courts. So a really important responsibility of the Geneva mission is to translate human rights on the ground here in Fiji so we can proceed on this journey, that we can hasten this journey to making the implementation of human rights more effective. And ultimately the test is this: if you are a member of society here of no particular status or wealth, if you have rights of access to all of the institutions which reflect human rights, then we're getting there. But we are never going to be perfect. We have to continue to strive for greater perfection.
So let's talk about Fiji's membership to the UNHCR. I understand that Fiji campaigned to be on the council, and towards the end of last year, I think it was in October, Fiji was elected along with 17 other new members. So let's talk about that.
Well, when we opened the Geneva mission in 2014, we sat in the council as an observer state. That means we didn't have a right to vote. We could co-sponsor resolutions, we were taking part in other mechanisms, for instance the inviting of special rapporteurs to Fiji, and of course we've now had 5 special, this is the 5th year of special rapporteurs, and we could do all of that, but we couldn't actually vote as a member of the council. And it was in 2014 that really we decided that we needed to work towards membership. And this last year, in 2018, we campaigned for membership. And the basis of membership is that we must be, of course, a member state of the United Nations. And we must have a record of promoting human rights in our own countries. And that's very important. And thirdly, we must take a seat that is allocated for our regional group. So we were very fortunate that we had what is called a clean slate in 2018. And so the number of seats which were available for the Asia-Pacific group were the number of candidates for the elections. But we needed very hard still to show everybody, all the other member states which had a right to vote in the United Nations General Assembly, that we were really serious about implementing human rights in Fiji, that we had already taken steps to implement some of the conventions that we have ratified. And it is that really which was the core of our campaign. In addition to that, countries which vie for membership should really have a set of voluntary pledges. And this is the promises that we make to the world that as members we will do these things. And we had a voluntary pledge made up of 9 promises. And of those 9 promises, one of the very important pledges that we made is that we would cooperate with the UN mechanisms which are designed to promote human rights globally. We take these pledges very seriously, and as a member we will keep the pledges in the center of our work to ensure that we work in accordance with what we promised the world.
Thank you for that. We'll be right back after a break. Welcome back. Now, you mentioned, Madam, that there are a certain number of seats allocated to the Asia-Pacific group. How does that work at the Council?
There are 13 seats allocated to the Asia-Pacific group, and in 2018 we were vying for 5 of them. And there were 5 candidates for 5. So we were fortunate in the sense that we were not actually competing with other members of our regional group. This has been the subject of criticism around the world by non-government organizations, which say that when you've got a clean slate, you end up having to vote for the candidates and not having enough space to choose not to vote for a particular country which has a bad human rights record, for instance. But I'm happy to say that the number of votes that we received, which was very high indeed, we had 187 votes. The number of votes that we received showed that countries really didn't doubt our determination to implement human rights. And I think that really was a reflection of the fact that during our campaign we also conveyed that determination. And not only that, we showed that we already have done many things to implement human rights, that we've already ratified a number of conventions, and we're on a journey of ratifying all the core United Nations human rights conventions. And not only that, that we have actually worked to implement them on the ground here in Fiji.
So this membership, of course, isn't permanent. It lasts 3 years.
3 years, yes.
And why is it on a temporary basis?
Well, it's got to be revolving. It's because everybody else has to have a chance to get on. But what is very interesting about our membership is that this is the first time a Pacific small island developing state has got membership of the Human Rights Council. I mean, it's extraordinary that in 2018, finally, a Pacific Island country gets onto the Human Rights Council. But that's partly an issue of capacity, partly an issue of the fact that the Pacific hasn't been in Geneva. It's only recently that we have opened missions in Geneva, and still the majority of Pacific Island countries do not have a mission in Geneva. So I think, the Pacific membership now of the Human Rights Council is a matter of congratulations for the region.
And in fact, Geraldine, what the ambassador just said highlights some of the issues that small island developing states generally face when it comes to engaging in multilateral and diplomatic talks at such high levels. So talk to us about some of the challenges that you faced since 2014, especially with the smallness of small island developing states and the general lack of expertise that we sometimes face at those levels.
Well, multilateralism really works for small island developing states because for a small country, in comparison with some of the giants around the world, we simply don't have the capacity to attend all the meetings all the time. No small island developing state has the luxury of having a very large mission with 100 diplomats. We don't have that capacity, and I don't think we're likely to have that capacity. Fiji, of course, has many other priorities. So the fact that we are able to work with other small island developing states and a forum that we call the Small States Forum, which is a forum of small states, not necessarily island states, means that we are able to have greater visibility and a louder voice in a number of international organizations. So I have mentioned that the Human Rights Council is probably the most important obligation that we have. But you know, it is also the home of the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the IPU, the ITU for telecommunications. There are dozens of international organizations in Geneva, and we are expected to cover them all. And, you know, for instance, we chair the support group of the UNISDR. And that's a recognition of the enormous progress that Fiji has made in implementing the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. We chair we have the Vice Presidency of the Human Rights Council this year, starting from January, but we are also on the steering committee of the IDMC, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We are also on the steering committee of the Platform for Disaster Displacement and a number of other organizations. So we've taken a leadership position, but we can't keep up unless we get progress in having greater support from the small island developing states. So that's really important for the success that Fiji has in Geneva.
And you've also spoken a little bit about regionalism there, the importance of these small island states to work together. Is that something that's been a focus for you for a long time?
It has. The only two SIDS countries which have been members of the Council in the past were the Maldives and Mauritius. And you know, they performed so well in such an outstanding way that it was an inspiration really for other SIDS to also vie for membership, and it was one of the reasons why we believed that we could do it. But we do work very closely with the other small states, and it's very important. If you have a dozen meetings on a particular morning, it's very important to be able to be tipped off by another SIDS ambassador who will say, you know, I think you should be at this meeting of the International Organization for Migration this morning. We're going to vote on a very important issue. You need to be there. So I think that particular camaraderie, that sense that we are all in this together as SIDS, that we have important priorities together, that's made a big difference to our ability to succeed in Geneva.
Having to shoulder all of these responsibilities, of course, is something that's unfathomable for the ordinary Fijian. How do you go about fulfilling all of these responsibilities and also having to touch base with us here in Fiji?
Well, I have a great team. The team in Geneva is picked for its ability to handle multilateral meetings, and I try to have an array of expertise. So, for instance, I have a second secretary who's a human rights expert, but she's also a gender expert. She also covers internal displacement and disaster risk reduction. So we allocate the work accordingly. Our first secretary covers trade and development, but because we're going to be so busy in the Human Rights Council, he will also help us with that workload. So we carefully map out the kind of expertise we need for particular meetings, but we're also very lucky. For instance, World Health Organization, we have a fantastic delegation which comes from the Ministry of Health here and covers the World Health Assembly every year. So we just manage the meetings up to the World Health Assembly, and then the delegation comes and we simply have a facilitative and a supportive role for the World Health Assembly. And similarly, we lean heavily on the Ministry of Trade here for our work in the World Trade Organization and the Attorney General's Chambers for Human Rights, as well as for WIPO, Intellectual Property. So really close relationships with line ministries here. We also cover Vienna. So UN Vienna covers drugs and crime. So that includes human trafficking, for instance, and control of firearms. And for those issues, we work very closely with the Ministry of Defense here. It's really challenging. I will not pretend that this is an easy workload. And when diplomats come to Geneva, I am very frank with them. I say, you know, this is not a 9-to-5 job. It's going to be very challenging. In one morning, you might be attending 3 meetings, all on 3 completely different topics. But the answer is good teamwork with the rest of the mission, and also preparation, and also a very clear understanding of what Fiji's national policies are on a number of issues. I mean, we should really know where we're going with disaster risk reduction. When we have a cyclone, you know, we check all the time with the media reports in Fiji to see how we're responding in Fiji. And then, because I think responses here are very good, we show off about it when we attend the UN ISDR meetings. And when we give our speeches, we say, you see, this is what Fiji does. And it's not just about showing off, it's also about sharing best practices and, you know, making Fiji visible, our progress, the work we do. This is all an important part of our role. It's this translation, what we do in Fiji to be showcased in Geneva, and what we do in Geneva to be implemented in Fiji.
Thank you. We'll be right back after another break. Welcome back. Ambassador, you spoke about the relationship that you have in Geneva with the Fijian government. How often, or rather how closely do you work with them? How often do you receive instruction or guidance from the government?
When the Human Rights Council is in session, daily. Because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to know what we're doing here, and similarly with the Attorney General's chambers, because they cover human rights. This is the Human Rights Ministry. So we have daily conversations, but throughout the year, whenever we have discussions about, for instance, a regional workshop, for instance, on the rights of persons with disabilities, then we would be briefing and taking instructions in relation to how much we can agree to in Geneva with OHCHR. We work very closely with OHCHR, which is the High Commissioner's Office, and that is very important also for ensuring that the government understands the conversations we're having with the High Commissioner's Office, similarly with the High Commissioner for Refugees. So I would say that daily we send briefings to Fiji, either to Foreign Affairs or to one of the other line ministries.
So we know for a fact that Fiji takes vice presidency of the council this year. We'll talk about that shortly. But generally over the past 4 or 5 years, Fiji has really stepped up its presence on the international arena. Why is this? And from the perspective, I mean, because you said you communicate with the government very regularly, what's the general plan or the reason for this?
I think that Fiji, as a small island developing state from the Pacific, is seen as an honest broker. A country with no particular agenda other than what is good for our people. And also because Fiji has a reputation of believing in multilateralism. It works for a small country to believe in multilateralism, and it's worked for us. But the other really important aspect of Fiji taking a leadership position in a number of these multilateral bodies is that we have ourselves built our capacity in this way. We've taken a very long-term view of developing international leadership. And so we're training diplomats in Fiji to prepare for leadership, and I think that's very important. You know, if you send a diplomat to a meeting in Geneva, they're not expected to just sit there and listen. For me, that's a waste of a really good diplomat. So you're expected to intervene, you're expected to speak, and eventually, because what you say, it makes good sense and supports an international conversation of solidarity, of integrity, of supporting international mechanisms, eventually you go for leadership because people recognize that what you say makes good sense and is principled. So that brings me to the third. I mean, apart from grooming people for leadership from day one, the third is to always take a principled position when it comes to voting records, to speaking, and to ensure that everything we do is grounded on a particular principle of public international law. And I think that also has really set us on this path of international leadership.
I mean, it's a very difficult position because you see some of the bigger countries with stronger embassies. Just by looking at the voting patterns at some of the councils, you can see that there's a lot of agenda pushing. So it must be very difficult to find a principled position, or rather stick to your principles in such a situation, right?
Well, we have to work around the fact that we also have bilateral relations with everyone. And for the first time, we're going to have to vote on the Human Rights Council. We've never had the right to vote before. But it is easier, in a way, to vote on the Human Rights Council, or particularly for thematic resolutions, because all we have to ask ourselves is, for instance, if the theme is the right to water, what we have to ask ourselves is, do we have a right to water in Fiji? Is this resolution consistent with a legal and constitutional position in Fiji? And let's support it, because that is an opportunity to really say to the world, we can support something which is so important for ordinary people, the right to water. But in managing our bilateral relations will now include explaining to specific countries why we've taken a position which is different from theirs. So we decide to support, for instance, a resolution on the right to development, which is supported by country A, but is not supported by country B. Then it's my job as the ambassador to say to country B, we will not be able to follow your position or to adopt your position because our national priorities is somewhere else. And countries understand. They will have to vote in a way that doesn't suit our national priorities, and then they will come and explain the same to us. But a very important role for an ambassador is to ensure that there is a seamless path to being able to vote on principle. And if they understand that you're doing this on principle and you haven't got some nefarious, underhand agenda, they will accept what you're telling them. And generally speaking, national priorities are not going to be the same in every country. So it's a very important exercise, I think, in diplomacy this year for Fiji.
Let's bring it back to Fiji taking presidency this year. What does this mean for the Geneva mission?
Well, it's going to need a greater attention for me, because I will be chairing a number of meetings on the council. It also means that as a member of the council, we will be and as vice president, we will also be chairing the Universal Periodic Review of other countries. So we have our own Universal Periodic Review this year in November, and that is a really excellent mechanism of the Human Rights Council. It's a peer review process where we sit in a room and ask questions of a country under review and make recommendations. So it means the vice president will have to chair a number of the UPR sessions, and what it means for the Geneva mission really is that the team is going to have to work harder to back up the delegation, our national delegation, to free me up to chair the council sessions. So it is going to be very important from a logistic point of view, but from a principled position, when you take a position of leadership like that on the council, then you become a member of the bureau, and it means that leadership is expected of Fiji this year to support mechanisms of the UN Human Rights Council, to ensure that the work of the Council is more efficient, that the organizational structure is such that all member states find that they can have an adequate and visible voice and presence. So it is very important. It's an opportunity to really lead on a mechanism of the United Nations which promotes global human rights. It's a great test of our ability to succeed on an international platform.
Thank you. We'll be right back after another break. Welcome back. Let's talk about some of the successes and failures of the mission in Geneva. We've just heard from you that Fiji sits on in a lot of these meetings. So talk to us about some of the very important, very relevant decisions to the country, how we voted, whether we were successful in our campaigns or not.
So we haven't voted yet on the Human Rights Council. The first opportunity we will have to vote will be in the February-March sessions of the Council, which is about to start. And the resolutions that we will be required to vote on will range from resolutions that affect countries which are in conflict or in trouble in some way, to resolutions which are thematic. So, as I said, the right to water, the rights of women and children, the right to development. These are important resolutions for a country like Fiji, and those will be voted on firstly in February-March, and then some will be voted on in the June-July session, and finally September-October. So the voting patterns then you will see will really showcase what Fiji stands for. And this is very important because it's time now to put our money where our mouth is and start to vote on human rights issues which are consistent with our constitution and which we believe should take center stage in the world. So that's going to happen fairly soon now. The other really important, I think, success of the work that we do in Geneva was the Universal Periodic Review process. So Fiji was reviewed in 2014. We had a very large delegation, and it was a very representative delegation of the different agencies in Fiji. And we carefully prepared the Universal Periodic Review process, and it is, we were very much admired for the way that we approached it. First of all, the seniority of the people who go to Geneva for the UPR reflects how importantly the country puts human rights as a national priority. So that was very successful, and I'm very proud of that success in 2014. As I've said, our third cycle is due this year. And I hope similarly that we will send a very high-powered delegation. Another really important success is the work that we've done to integrate human rights and climate change. There has been for the past 4 years a climate change resolution in the Human Rights Council. And the idea of that resolution is to show that people are really in the center of a conversation when you're talking about climate change adaptation and mitigation. So when we arrived, we got very involved in those negotiations, and we worked very closely with the core group to get a climate change resolution on displacement, which is very important for Fiji and the Pacific. And last year we did one on gender and climate change. So we're looking forward this year to a theme which again is going to advance a conversation important for Fiji. So that to us was a very important discussion. Another important success was that we opened the doors, we issued a standing invitation to the special mandate holders of the United Nations. That means the special rapporteurs who've been coming every year since 2014 because we've opened the doors, and we've had some really good constructive conversations with these special rapporteurs, and then they go back to the council, they report on the country visit to Fiji, they make recommendations, and then we respond to that. And that's been part of our journey for implementing human rights as well. It doesn't mean we accept everything that is recommended, but we accept everything that we can. And everything that we can in accordance with our national vision for Fiji. So that's an important success as well. Also, I think important is the technical assistance and the capacity building support we get from the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner. So we recognize that, there are a large number of children in our court system. And if the children are giving evidence in court, are our judges and magistrates properly equipped to handle that evidence is a very important human rights issue. So we work with OHCHR to run workshops here in Fiji for our judges and our magistrates and our legal profession on helping children communicate better in court. The idea is not to predetermine whether a child is telling the truth or not. It's very important. The judge will determine that. But to ensure that there's a level playing field and an atmosphere in court which allows children to speak freely. And that, I think, is a very important priority for Fiji with a large number of cases in court.
It's very interesting that you highlighted that last bit, because in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of cases of gender-based and sexual violence cases being brought forward, quite a number of those including children, and them having to go up and actually having the courage to give evidence against the perpetrators. And sometimes we hear of talk where these children are not able to open up, maybe because they feel intimidated, maybe because they're not able to explain themselves well, and those in the legal profession aren't able to deal with them. What would you advise those who are out there dealing in these particular areas? What would they be best able to do to help these children?
Well, first of all, sexual violence against women and children is a form of discrimination against them. And so therefore, ensuring that the court system, the police force, the social welfare department are able to deal effectively with offences against women and children is a human rights priority. It is a human rights priority for Fiji. And the Human Rights Council has been very, very strong on empowering women and children in cases of violence against women and children. And there is an annual discussion on this very subject in the Human Rights Council. And we have participated in that discussion and learned from the experiences of other countries on this subject. What I would say is this, is that when you look at sexual and gender-based violence, you have to look at it as a systemic problem. Of course, it's a reflection of patriarchal attitudes towards women and children, of course, because what people are doing is taking advantage of vulnerability. But very importantly, how are the institutions responding to children who come forward and make a complaint, bearing in mind that there is a dark figure of unreported crime against women and children. So many women and children who don't want to complain because they don't think the system's going to work for them, and many of them don't even realize the crime's been committed. I would say it's very, very important to take a holistic view on training at all levels of the justice system. And in addition to that, to ensure that when children come to court, there are a number of opportunities and number of possibilities for hearing their evidence. Is it going to be closed-circuit television? Is it going to be in court but with a screen? Is there some other way of taking their evidence? Fortunately, the law allows that kind of array of possibilities. So really, I think training to help judges and magistrates understand how that works. And also for us to remember that when you put a child on a screen or behind on closed-circuit television, you're not saying to the court, we believe this child. What we're saying is, let's remove the barriers to giving evidence that a child experiences because of the different way children communicate, in order that we hear her evidence. Whether or not she's telling the truth, that's a matter for the court. And so here we have the rights of a child in relation to victims being balanced against the rights of the accused to a fair trial. Very much a human rights conversation, and a very important one for the judiciary, for social welfare, for the police force, and for society actually.
When we come back, we'll have the final segment for you. Welcome back. This year on the Council, as you've mentioned, the vote needs to be in line with the Constitution and the national vision of Fiji. But is that the only thing that will guide the decisions this year on the Council?
No. We are going to be guided by our pledges. So one of the most important pledges we made when we went for membership is that we will support the mechanisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council. That means the special mandate holders, the special rapporteurs, the work of the OHCHR, the work and the reports of the independent experts and the missions which visit countries and report back, and also the resolutions of the Council itself. So we are committed to upholding a global framework for human rights as expressed through the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. So as much as possible, we are committed to upholding the work of the Council. So when independent experts come back from a particular country and they say, look, it's terrible out there. People are dying by the day. There's starvation, there's poverty, and there's lack of access to medical services. And a resolution is then moved that, you know, that country should allow medical services to help the people who are starving and ill. Then, of course, Fiji must support a recommendation made by one of the mechanisms on the basis of evidence. Somebody's gone, somebody's seen, and they're coming back and they're saying the people there need help. And it's really important, and in accordance with our pledge when we went for membership, that we should in fact support those mechanisms. So it's important that we respect the promises we made when we went for membership, and also that we maintain the integrity of the international human rights system.
Looking at all the pledges and of course the successes of those pledges, how will those be implemented in Fiji in real time? For us here as an ordinary Fijian, many of us would not have any idea of what's being talked about or what's being done at those high-level meetings, but to actually feel the impact of the decisions that are made there, how would that be carried forward here in Fiji?
I would say that there are three really important mechanisms for implementation. One is working with the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission to make sure that the HRADC knows what's happening on the Human Rights Council and uses the resolutions and the recommendations of the Council to implement work here. So the Human Rights Council work should be part of the HRADC work program. I think that's very important. Secondly, the UPR process. In the UPR process, member states are going to be making recommendations to us about how they think we should further our human rights record. So, for instance, you know, in the last UPR, they said you should ratify all the core UN conventions, and we agreed. We agreed. So we're committed to that. And so that's another very important mechanism for translating rights here. But the third one is the kind of conversation we're having now. You know, it's really important that every person in Fiji knows what the Council is, knows that it's relevant for the work here, and will use that kind of knowledge, whether it's through social media or watching the webcasts, will really understand that our membership of the Human Rights Council is not intended as some sort of a process of self-congratulation. It is a process which is intended to further human rights implementation in Fiji. That's its value. So we've promised, we've said we will do it, and now we must be held to account. And so everybody, it's in the interest of every citizen in Fiji to follow our work, to ensure that what we do there is consistent with the commitments that we've made here, either in our constitution or in the pledges that we made. So really important 3 mechanisms for implementation. And in all of this, very important to acknowledge the work of civil society in Fiji. Civil society is often the voice which tells us what's happening in the informal settlements, in places that we don't necessarily know. There is, for instance, a breach of rights. And so when civil society talks about them, then we immediately know that there's an issue and we need to deal with it and we need to respond. And often the questions raised by civil society will be raised in Geneva. And then, therefore, it's important that we know and acknowledge the role of civil society in the implementation of human rights.
So, Geraldine, our goal today was to let everyday Fijians know what's actually happening at the United Nations. And we thank you for taking your time out and helping us do that. We hope that we've achieved the goals that we set out to do this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you all the best for all the work that's coming up this year.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's all we have for you tonight. We hope to see you again next week. Good night.